All right, we're back with round two. Here we go. So this is what's next for Jamstack. Really excited to be here and continue the discussion. We've got four awesome panelists here today. Let's do a quick round of introductions, starting with Stephanie.
Hi, everyone. Good to see my fellow panelists. I am Stephanie Eckles, around the web 5T3PH, and I talk a lot about CSS and 11D, but my day job is as software engineering at Microsoft.
Great to have you here, Stephanie. Phil.
Thanks.
Hey, well, thanks for having me. First of all, I'm Phil Hawksworth. I'm part of the team at Netlify, and I've been banging on about Jamstack for what seems like a really long time, and just a big enthusiastic about simple web architectures and building stuff for the web. So been following some of this conversation and the last panel closely and enjoying the chat. So very happy to be part of it this time.
Welcome, Phil.
Thank you.
Henri.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me? I don't think I was able to do that test, but I'm assuming
loud and clear.
Very loud.
All right, awesome. So my name's Henri, best or worst known on the Twitter sphere. I'm sorry, the socials as Henri Helvetica. I tend to hang around the web performance space. And yeah, I've always been sort of like a fan and, curious about the Jamstack. Thank you, Phil Hawksworth, for introducing me some years back. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So I'm happy to be here to, hang out.
Happy to have you here. Brian.
Hey, so yeah, Brian Rinaldi. My day job is developer experience engineer on Starkly, but I've been doing Jamstack stuff since, well, I think I got my start like 2013, so it wasn't Jamstack yet. It was pre-Jamstack. Doing, Jekyll and Hugo and all kinds of stuff. Way back, I had like a whole thing project where I showed all the different static site generators and how you might do the same project in those different ones, which was really popular. Wrote some books about it, and have a lot of opinions about it as well. So looking forward to the conversation.
Me too. Glad to have you here, Brian. So we're going to start off just highlighting some of the press and blogs that we got last time. First, from the last panel, first was this article from Salma, which did a great deep dive on and recap of the panel. Then we have Brian Robinson doing a recap as well. And the new stack. Yeah, this article just came out last week, just doing a deep dive on and breaking apart the panel. So it's awesome to get this content coming out of these panels. There's been a few things that have really got me thinking this week. This article starts off with this: if you can't define something, does it really exist? Yeah, I think it's a really good point from Lorraine Lawson. Let's start with that one. So, we spent an hour last time trying to grapple with the definition, and it's been a problem, a conversation throughout Jamstack's whole history. So, why is it so hard to define, and does it exist if it's that hard to define? Who wants to kick off?
I mean, it sounds like it's going to be Brian's show, so let's just give it to him.
I hope not. Oh, but I would say something I've kind of talked about a lot in years past. I think, it's not, if you can't define something, like I think all of us could come up with some kind of loose definition of what we think Jamstack is, even today. It's not necessarily there's a difference between can I not define it versus can I not define it clearly. And I think there's a lot of things in technology that we can't necessarily define clearly, and a lot of terminology that's very kind of loose about what exactly it means. I mean, I also talk a lot about serverless. I mean, what the heck is serverless? It's a whole bunch of things. I mean, And part of that, I think, is just the natural maturation of a particular set of technologies, whereby we start out with a term and a set of tools, and it's very, very narrow. And then we start to kind of grow as we try to meet the needs of various people in the community, what they're trying to build, and so on and so forth. And it's naturally going to kind of expand. If you think about like even serverless, when it started, it was kind of narrow. It was lambdas for the most part. Okay? And like now it covers a whole breadth of things. I mean, nobody was talking about databases and serverless back then, but now databases is serverless. So like, the point is, over time, these things change, and it's going to naturally mean that it's going to be a little less clear to define it, because it kind of depends on who you talk to and what tools they're using, and they'll give you kind of a variation of the definition. So I think it's a good question, but I also think somewhat misleading, because we can all sort of define it. We just probably don't all agree on the definition, and it's maybe a little bit vague, but that's no different than so many other things we touch on.
And I was actually I'm going to support your comment, and I'm going to remind everyone of what, the web performance community has been going through for the last 3 or 4 years at least. Once upon a time, web performance was pretty kind of like ones and zeros, and it's absolutely not right now. And, we have acronyms, and we have acronyms that live within the acronym, and there's so much to look at right now in perf that, if someone were to say like, well, what's web performance? It's like, where do I start? And so the idea that if something is not well defined, does it exist? It absolutely does. But, in our case, in performance as well, I can sort of illustrate the maturation, as Brian said, of performance and performance definitions. And a lot of things just come about as the research comes out, as more information gets released, as technology evolves, and something that you may have not talked about 2 years ago, now you can, for a number of reasons. You know what I mean? Like languages change, and there are things that we can do now that we couldn't say a few years back. So, as Brian said, I think I don't say it's misleading, but it feels a little puerile as a statement.
I'll just say that my introduction to Jamstack as a concept, or I should really just say as a word, was 5 years ago now, when we picked Gatsby to run our documentation site, which seemed like a great choice at the time. And I just vaguely was like, they're like, we're Jamstack. I'm like, okay. Whatever, you output pages in a way that feels right to me at this moment in time to fit the needs of this project. And then a few years later, found Eleventy just on my own, and had a new view of Jamstack, presented to me that didn't match the same view as what I experienced with Gatsby, right? So even just in the time of Jamstack, we had pretty opposing systems, I would say, as a user of those two sides of the spectrum. But what it kind of means to me now is, or what I appreciate, that it brought to us more than tools and, concepts of static and or not, is sort of this groundswell in the community to support web fundamentals. And so, not to go counter to the whole topic of what we're discussing, but I don't know, is that what we want? Is that the takeaway? The community, and I know that was brought up in the previous stream as well, like the community, and what is it more about guiding, not necessarily guiding, but continuing the momentum in the community that matches some of those ideals, including performance or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll just let's come back to that one. I'll just let Phil go, and that'll be the next topic.
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is I love that. I mean, I really subscribe to that very much as well. And I don't know, Jamstack's such a funny one because it feels to me like it is hard to define, or we've made it hard to define. Maybe one of those two sentences is true. I don't know, but I think one of the things that's been difficult is that we conflate what it is with what it gives us. You know, the more we've tried to describe it and justify it, I think, coming from an age of people didn't really like to think about static sites because they weren't exotic enough, considered powerful enough, considered worthy enough. Whereas I think of static being a massive attribute, but that's another thread to the conversation. But, trying to position these things as something that does feel appropriate and adequate for lots of different types of sites. I think we started to put more vocabulary into the description that talks about the benefits and some of the side effects of it, which really muddied the waters. I loved the conversation that the last panel had. Some of the definitions I agreed with, some of them I did not agree with, but that's okay, because there are some things in there that I really, really enjoyed. I loved the expression that Zach used, which is, not just because of its alliteration, but he said a folder full of files. And it's like, yeah, that's where I started from. And that doesn't describe any of the benefits, any of the characteristics of how things behave, any of the workflows, which are the things that I really associate with Jamstack because I think of what it can give you. But that's not necessarily helpful when you say, what's the thing? But the thing that I've really found is a common thread is that the people who've been enthusiastic about Jamstack, typically I found, as Stephanie says, tend to be people who care about a lot of the fundamentals of the web and the behaviors of the web that certainly I hold dear. And that's one of the things that really attracted me to it and made me want to be a part of the community and kind of push it along and contribute as much as I could. So I don't know which question or which topic I was answering there, but there are some words I've said out loud.
Yeah, I want to try and wrap all of that together into a topic because I think there are lots of interesting points there. Where
do we have a new acronym? FFOF, folder full of files?
Yeah, it's the FOF community.
Exactly. That'll be interesting. Sorry about that.
Don't add the word stack to it because then it gets complicated. Just everyone stop. Right, we solved it. We can end the call early.
Yeah. So Henri was talking about in the web performance community, like this growing level of complexity and acronyms on acronyms, which, like, when you zoom into a topic far enough, like you need that because you need new language and there's all these new ideas. But the counter to that is it makes it so hard for a newcomer to get into it because there's all this stuff you need to learn. And I feel like Jamstack, to Stephanie's point, went through that same thing. Is it started off basically meaning static sites, maybe a little bit more, and then it kind of grew and grew and grew, and now Stephanie described the two camps. You kind of, well, there's like multiple camps now. There's like the static site browser kind of camp. There's the spa camp, and now there's the serverless functions and dynamic rendering camp, and it's this umbrella that's trying to group all of those together, which has been a real challenge. So, how do we navigate that? Like, is it about shrinking it down into one of those camps? Do we want it to be on the complex side of things or on the simple, welcoming to newcomers side? Yeah, what's everyone's thoughts there?
I mean, you're kind of asking, should we peel it back to values or do we need to focus on the technical underpinnings is what I'm kind of hearing. Like, I mean, when you bring up the idea of newcomers, which of course I fully support having easier entry to the web. And that's where I was kind of talking about the groundswell in the community, just like that has become a benefit associated with Jamstack. And so obviously that's a positive, I'd say, regardless of how you choose to really, really define it. But it's just kind of an interesting, it's a different spin on how you're going to define it if you're going to go for values as well.
My thought on this, is basically, I got into it because it was simple, right? Like that was the thing I loved about it. It's like, okay, I get this. I mean, I've been doing web dev for like 26, 27 years now. And like even at the time in 2013, I was like, things had felt complex and this felt simple. And I understood how all this worked. And that's kind of what I loved about it. And then it did it got really complex. It still is kind of complex, but I think I don't know that there's a need to like make this kind of line in the sand separation between complex Jamstack and simple Jamstack. I think it is important that there are paths for people who want to get into it. And I think tools like Eleventy, even other tools like Astro tend to kind of have like a nice glide path into Jamstack it doesn't have like a big high burden to get over, tough learning curve or whatever. But then if back then when we were doing the early days, it was like, okay, I kept writing about it and I'm like, well, the thing you have to understand is it's only good for like this tiny subset of sites that it's not that tiny, but still like, okay, if you want to do anything that has any kind of real interaction, you're probably gonna like start to move outside of the toolings that we're using. And so that was a problem, because I think it kind of inhibited that's why the term came about. It's like we were having a struggle selling this beyond just the small niche of people. And so like to me it's like it's fine. I think it can get complex. I think anything you're going to do can get complex. I obviously, because my day job is at LaunchDarkly, I talk about LaunchDarkly all the time. And like at a basic level, it's just feature flags. And yeah, it's super, super simple, but can it get really complex? Of course it can. Do I start you there? Absolutely not. So like, I think, but if it didn't get there, it's would be a tool you're like, I could just, I don't really need that, So I think, having those paths in and having tools that give that ability that are starting to kind of gain some adoption is great, that give people a way to start and like get those web fundamentals. It's awesome. But having the ability to kind of expand on that and get more complex as you need to is also awesome. So like I don't think that the two there needs to be like a line drawn, like, okay, once you've gotten over this level of complexity, you're no longer Jamstack,
Oh, so someone's going to say something.
Go ahead, Henri.
Go ahead, Phil. Please.
Oh, look, we're going to have a polite off and both stand and others. Okay, I'll talk. I'll talk then. I'm broadly nodding along in agreement, but there's one thing that I wonder if this kind of deviates my thinking from Brian's is that, or rather, one of the things that makes it difficult to have an idea or a word. I think Stephanie summarized it better. Jamstack's a word. Maybe we should stop there. But a word like Jamstack, that it starts simple, but yes, it could get more and more complex and greater and greater. But I think that's usually true for something like a product, where you can have an entry point and you can do the hello world and you can get started and the model gets larger. Since Jamstack isn't a product, you can't buy a Jamstack or get a license for Jamstack. And there are so many things that kind of can be involved in it. I think the idea of starting simple and growing is a little bit difficult there, because at its core, it feels like it needs to be a mental model or some kind of way of thinking that I think that's just a difficult thing to start small and then grow. And I wonder if that's one of the reasons that we've stumbled a little bit because of that. Because, when we talk about it as a simple thing, I think a lot of us nod about it. But as soon as we start thinking about the ways that it could grow, then some of the definitions that we put in place start to break down, or at least that's my thinking. So I think that's maybe one slight challenge I'd have for Brian is just about that idea of it expanding in complexity is I'm way more comfortable thinking about that as a product or as a thing, and I don't know if Jamstack is that, and I wonder if that's why it's been difficult. That's just my first reaction, at least, to that.
So I wanted to add the following, and I'm going to agree with Phil here because, and while I think Stephanie or maybe Brian was speaking, I was going back and looking for a tweet that I specifically remember because I was doing this thing with Stoyan, the perf calendar, and I remember someone had written something along the lines of, this is actually a pretty good overview of all the different rendering methods explained in a few words. Okay. And I remember reading it and thinking, oh, wow. So it's a long list of rendering methods, which kind of like falls into that Jamstack world and also performance world, which is why I sort of bookmarked it. But this person listed single page applications, multi-page applications, SSG, SSR, partial hydration, progressive hydration, island architecture, progressive enhancement, incremental static generation, streaming SSR, resumability, edge rendering. And I was thinking to myself, man, these would make awesome blog posts. But also I'm thinking to myself, someone entering the field and hearing Jamstack and being presented that tweet is going to think like, what is this? That's one. And I've always remembered that tweet. And, like I said, I had a bookmark. But again, I feel like, again, there's a parallel to performance where I will be the first one to say performance got complicated, and someone starting from performance, say like a year ago, is going to look around and say, holy smokes, I just threw up web page tests and I've seen more numbers that I've seen in like my entire career at school, including like, my math doctorate. And it's complicated, and depending on your entry point, it can be daunting. And I'm going to keep going here. Just hear me out. So I'm thinking of all the CMSs in the past that have been, comfortably part of like the Jamstack community. And they're always, no, I shouldn't say that. They keep an eye on sort of, WordPress's, market share, and that's there for a number of reasons. But, WordPress users would always tell you like, well, it's simple, right? I can do what I want easily. And I remember being at WordCamp this past year, WordCamp US. I was invited, but I really wanted to go to kind of hear what the community was talking about. Since, again, WordPress seems to be sort of like, this sort of product that people look at like, man, I'd like to get that kind of like, adoption, yada, 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 from CMSs, again, that are part of the Jamstack community. But I was speaking to a couple WordPress developers. They had no idea what Jamstack was. They had absolutely no idea. And I was like, okay, dude, just ping me on LinkedIn. I can't believe I said that. But I was like, ping me on LinkedIn. I'm going to send you some documentation. I sent him Phil's book from a few years ago and a couple other things. But it sat with me like, the Jamstack has had profound effect for a number of us, small community, absolutely none for a huge community out there. And I think of someone from WordPress trying to transition to Jamstack, and I think it would be just potentially a nightmare for them, right? So, the idea that it's not complicated, it can be simple, but we certainly have put out there that there's so much involved, or that can be involved, that it could be pretty daunting to jump in. Now,
can I
oh, go ahead, because
you're in mid-flow. Sorry, I thought you were finishing a thought. You keep going.
I mean, I feel like this is probably a question afterwards, but I was actually going to ask everyone here because I think I'm the only one who's not an author on this panel. And I was going to ask everyone if some of their work in the past with regards to the Jamstack, if they felt that someone coming in and picking up their book would be in a good place to start. But I feel like that may or should come in after what Phil's going to say.
Well,
Yeah.
I'll just speak very, very quickly, and then I'll hand over. But I was going to kind of address that a little bit with the question of, if someone's coming in and starting this, they're not really starting with like learning how to build with Jamstack. They're learning how to build with one or many of loads of frameworks that can kind of fit into what we describe as Jamstack. So they're not learning Jamstack. They're learning Gatsby and Next and Nuxt and 11t and Astro and goodness knows what, and like mixing and matching all of the technologies that go along with it. So that's one of the reasons I feel it can feel incredibly daunting, because it is such a broad kind of church of technologies rather than one of those. So anyway, that's what I was just kind of offering, just thinking about what you were saying about people getting started. But Brian, sorry, I interrupted Brian, I think.
Oh, no, you didn't. I sorry. But I was going to challenge. I think you both have an excellent point, but I'm going to challenge you and say, I mean, how is that any different than if they just were going to be like, oh, I want to do web development? Where do you think they're going to get thrown in? I mean, they're going to get thrown into a similar world of complexity that's like, actually, in some ways, I feel like Jamstack somewhat narrows the view a little bit and arguably reduces that not by much. And the argument being like, well, Jamstack is web development now, I guess. I mean, it was always, but like it is synonymous. That's why the term isn't useful or whatever. I don't know that I believe that, but the point is, like, web development got complicated. I mean, they'll probably get thrown into React and the whole React ecosystem that's complicated. And will they be producing any better sites that way? Will they have an easier time getting on board that way? I mean, maybe. I don't know. But I wouldn't say it's like dramatically more difficult than just web development as a whole. And they're still going to have to learn things like SSR and SSG and web. I mean, all the like rendering methods plus things like hooks. And I mean, it's like it gets complicated. And so it's not. I don't think this is a problem specific to Jamstack.
I don't think it's a problem specific to Jamstack either. I remember, oh my God, I'm looking at her and I'm forgetting her name. Rachel Andrew had mentioned, like, if she had to start, today, she doesn't know if she'd really get into web development, because she also acknowledged and realized it was complicated. But I just feel like, and I'm not saying that regular web development is not complicated, because it certainly is, but I just think of potentially like what's the, and I don't want to use it like it's an adjective, whatever, but what's the Jamstack's hello world, right? Like, the web development one we know is like 3 or 4 lines, and the Jamstack one is not necessarily 3 or 4 lines, at least in my assessment. Now, you wouldn't use any of those frameworks just to push up just a hello world. That's the point. And again, having spoken to some people out there who were, again, completely removed, they had no idea what was going on, and a lot of times I go to these conferences to kind of like get a feel for what is really happening, like how far into my own bubble am I, and to try to understand what it's like, for the rest of the community out there. So I kind of just wanted to kind of throw that out there, because I do think that, when we get together with people who are familiar with the Jamstack, you're in all likelihood, not saying automatically, but you're in all likelihood, you have a group of persons who have some proficiency in web development. Now, that could be that, I may not be 100% correct there, but I do think these are people who, as someone mentioned earlier, who understand like the architectures and stuff like that, and can sort of paint these models in their heads before they even, get in front of their computer. What do you think? What are you thinking, Stephanie? I see the wheels grinding in your head.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing, it seems like we're all interested in this idea of how does a newbie get started, whether they're new to the web or new to Jamstack. And And I was also kind of alongside that thinking it's become a radical idea somehow to build close to the metal of the web.
Yeah.
And that's part of what Jamstack means to me. To not get too pedantic about it. If we just think of the vibe, right? What is the vibe that it's become? And that's what it is to me is folks. I already kind of mentioned this, but I just keep coming back to it. It's folks that are passionate about the web as it exists as a medium. And so I know in the last stream you're kind of putting a little more finer point on it, some bullet points to the definition, portable particularly stood out to me. But when you are closer to the metal of the web, that's what drives the portability. You aren't locked into vendors, frameworks, whatever. But at the same time, I mean, why I became, I jokingly say I'm the unofficial ambassador to 11D, which I've kind of dropped that a little bit in the past few months. But, what that really was trying to say when I said that is that it has become the basis for everything. Not, 11D is great just as a tool, but mostly because I could either throw up a simple hello world, a single page site, and I'm still going to use it because I enjoy the creature comforts of that environment. I enjoy writing in Markdown, for example. But then on the other side, I'm also still using 11D, wanting to use that bare metal of the web, but I need some more flavor. So I have serverless functions so that I can do a membership site run by 11D, which again, sounds radical. There were folks that would probably try to tell me that's silly, don't do that. But it's possible. And I know there's the argument, is that still static? Is that still, is that still Jamstack? But I think the underlying idea is that we have a positive movement towards those fundamentals and that ability to grow. Maybe you're jumping outside of the bounds of Jamstack at that point, but is it a bad thing to bring us, just kind of community core back to the fundamentals at the same time?
Yeah, it's a great point.
And I also have to drop off pretty soon. So
yeah, just whenever you're ready, drop off. But Stephanie's got to go soon. But yeah, really glad you made it. And
I don't think we should let her go because everything that she says needs putting on a t-shirt.
Yeah,
to be very honest.
That's true.
don't tell the bots.
So I want to go on that comment a bit. We talk about drawing bounds around it and making static the core. And to Brian's point before, it's like, well, there's a lot of things that don't fit into that world that aren't possible. Is that okay? And how do we navigate that as a community? Like, I think one issue with Jamstack is that we got really dogmatic, being like, that's not Jamstack, that is Jamstack. I feel like it should be fine to work outside of the bounds of static. Like, no one should feel guilty about that. But it's having that core thing that you come back to and you're trying to get to. Stephanie, what do you think about that? Like, how do we describe that without people drawing these hard lines and being dogmatic, what it is and what it isn't?
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts, Stephanie?
I'll lead it off. I do have to drop, unfortunately, but I will circle back to hear your answers because you have some great voices in the room, as it were, to continue to noodle on that. But thanks again for the opportunity. I'm sorry to cut out, but see you all around the web.
Thanks, Steph.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Good to see you.
I have a feeling her answer was going to be great.
Find me on Matt.
Let's try and work out what Stephanie's answer is going to be. That can be the rest of the panel.
See ya.
Bye, Stephanie.
Bye.
I'd say like we did. I mean, the being dogmatic about it was like kind of funny because it's like ultimately like nobody cares whether it's Jamstack or not. I mean, Jamstack was the loose term anyway. So like, I always tell people like, I mean, if you gotta, if you get to a point in your application, you gotta build it, and you gotta do something that is in Jamstack. I mean, who the heck cares? You do what you got to do. Like, you're either doing this for work and that's your job, and you got things you got to do, or this is a fun project, but you're trying to meet like some kind of goal. Like you have features you're trying to build, and whether they fit within Jamstack or not really is irrelevant. So I don't know. I think we maybe some folks got a little silly about kind of focusing on that definition and giving it more importance than it really needed. I kind of start with the idea of, there's that principle of least power kind of thing. When you want to try and use the tool that basically has the least amount of power that you need to get where you need to get, what you need to build. And that's kind of where I start. It's like, can I build this all static? Can I just flat out be like, I run CFE.dev and it's still a Hugo site entirely. I did have membership at one point. I don't anymore. I ripped that out. But like, it has some dynamic pieces. And I don't really, I'm actually looking at, okay, there's pieces I want to add that actually aren't that easy to add in Hugo. So now maybe I have to consider, like, do I move off of Hugo and start integrating some other tool? But it's been running for 6 years successfully without that, right? So, you can you can start simple, and then get more complex. And some of these tools, I think, allow you, like, that's what I'm excited about some of the newer tools. It's like tools like 11e, as Stephanie was showing, will allow you to start simple and go static, but add some of that complexity in. And there might be a point where you're like, okay, after a while, I've got to a point where maybe 11e doesn't fit anymore, and I need to go more complex. That's okay. And we refactor and rebuild applications all the time. So this doesn't have to be like, it's not a lifelong commitment. Like, I built this in 11e, and damn it, I'm going to stick with 11e. All things be damned, right? Like, it's so. Anyway, I think she's got a point in the starting with the simplicity. I think so, and starting close to the metal as much as you can, and and finding a tool that allows you maybe to grow to where you think you might need to grow, and if at some point in the future that needs to change, okay, change it.
Yeah. Totally. Change it or expand on it. I think I couldn't agree more with keeping the robustness principle and the rule of least power kind of at heart in general, as when we build for the web, but that should extend, as you're saying, Brian, to your architectural choices. And this is another example for me, of where some of the mental models and some of the benefits and behaviors you get from the very simplistic Jamstack model of a folder full of files, if you like. Once you start expanding that into, well, Stephanie was saying before she left, if I needed to, I'd add some serverless functions. And are those Jamstack? Well, I don't know, maybe not, because they're not necessarily a folder full of files, because they are executed at request time. However, they fit into the part of the mental model which is, well, I've been deploying my site as a folder full of files, and now that's allowed me to use whichever hosting environment, whichever automation to deploy that with low friction. And now you can do that with serverless functions as well. So the things they share in common are the behaviors and the workflows, and the fact that there isn't a server that you maintain. Mm-hmm. But my goodness, the things that are in play are now very different to a folder full of static files. There are lots of different things. So it's very different in one regard, but it's very similar in the way that you interact with it as a developer. So at that point, should you adopt a different name for it? I don't know. And ultimately, I don't think it matters, other than the debates about trying to define this thing so it helps people have an on-ramp. And just like one more thought on that, when hearing about Rachel Andrews saying, I don't know how I would get started in it. I think one of the reasons that that's difficult is the fact there are so many people around who are opinionated about the right way to do things, that if you start doing something and you share with people how your proud work, there's so many people who come out of the woodwork and say, well, you're doing it wrong, or that's not the right way to do it. And I think that's also kind of evident in, well, now this isn't the right thing to call that. I used to make sites on the LAMP stack that sometimes, I don't know if I'm allowed to admit this, didn't have a MySQL database at all. You know, I was just using PHP, and I don't remember anyone coming after me and saying, "No, that's the lap stack," you know, or
Yeah,
I don't
you're
know.
banned from the internet. You're
Oh no, exactly.
You're not welcome here.
Yeah.
That's funny. Oh man, Phil, you said something that I wanted to support, but I can't remember. You know, things get. Oh, here's what I was going to say. You know, it's just a modern stack. You know, this is how we can look at it in 2024, just because of the services, the capabilities that have been built for the web to operate at a potentially uh, more sort of like sophisticated way. You know, yes, there are some complications, but they're not necessarily there to be used on the spot. Like you said, maybe suddenly you want to add some serverless functions. It's like, okay, we can do that. Um, what I wanted to sort of, because I've thought about this in the past as well, in terms of like, well, you know, that's not how we used to do it, whatever. I kind of compare that to music. You know, once upon a time, you know, you'd have arguments between jazz musicians like, yo, that's not jazz enough, man. You know, it's like, you know, whatever it is. And people would have arguments over music. Like we're having arguments right now over hip hop. What's hip hop? You know, like the 90s guys are like, yo, that's not hip hop, bro. You know, and the newcomers are just like, oh man, this is a vibe, man. And I kind of, even though I'm not crazy about the new stuff, but I get it. You know, this is sort of like a change, and there's a bit of a new audience, and you know, it's something a little different, yada yada yada, how it's produced. But at the end of the day, it's like we'll say hip hop. It's like, oh yeah, yeah, I know what you mean. You know, so I kind of look at it like that when you sort of, you know, look at the, you know, the sort of debates that have happened over music, kind of like the same.
Yeah, I feel the same way.
What-
I'm like the new stuff. I get it, but give me the old stuff.
I when Phil was talking, it made me think the other thing is it doesn't even have to be like necessarily adding on to your existing, like, oh, we're gonna throw on like serverless functions. I mean, your entire site doesn't necessarily have to be on single application. I mean, it could, if you decide, hey, I'm gonna build this part of my site that doesn't, I can't fit within whatever tool you're using. I mean, okay, I mean, you could build that part in a different tool. It doesn't have to be like, well, you know, I have to stick to Lemby, Astra, whatever, because that's what I started in. I mean, like these are not like, I think people get kind of stuck on things that's just a really ultimately unimportant to the end user. What's, you know, and I think if we start close to the metal, like Stephanie said, we'll have a better performing app to, you know, to your focus, Henri. We'll have a simpler app to build. And even if ultimately like we have to go and expand to like, oh, hey, you know, this part I can't do in 11e, so I'm going to do it in Next.js. I mean, okay, that's fine. I mean, it'll be more complex, but sometimes that happens.
For sure. Yeah, let's I think we've got to the whiteboard portion of the panel. So let's fire it up. And
Whiteboard.
or slide deck. Let's slide deck portion of the panel. So let's go on that point. Brian, you said you were talking about apps there, which, yeah, I think just describing what, how do I phrase this? Like, what is under this umbrella? I feel like the majority of the web is not apps; it's just websites. The long tail, but maybe the most highly trafficked properties on the web are apps. So it's like trying to like combine those things together. I think is interesting to work out where the umbrella of Jamstack fits over that. So just recapping from last time, these are the core pillars that we came up with: portable, immutable, delivered as HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It's not dynamic rendering, and then down with capitalism, which I got heavily quoted on.
Okay.
Maybe we can try and bring down capitalism today. That'd be a good outcome for the panel, or an interesting outcome, I should say. So, I think we're missing one here of what, like, these are the pillars, but what is Jamstack? Does anyone have, like, we had a folder full of folder full
Yeah,
of
I love the idea that we'll stick with the acronym and then good luck everybody. Just
yeah. Full of
I'm not entirely on board with the not dynamic rendering though. I mean, I've been on the like this before, and I've always kind of like go back to like I am static first, but I'm not static only. And I don't know how many, because I feel like that you're right. So many sites can be purely static that just on for no good reason. But I also feel like, I mean, I don't want to box people in with a definition that's like so rigid and narrow that like, it's just to me it's like, okay, well that's not going to fit my use case and which is fine as well, but it's also like we wouldn't get them on board with maybe this static first idea if we go to them like, oh yeah, no, once you get into rendering, you're outside our box. You're not part of Jamstack. But I mean, you can do what you want to do, but I don't know. That to me it's like if the goal is a better web, and if the goal is that we get build better sites with better performance, so on and so forth, which is kind of like the core of what Jamstack was promising from day one, saying only no static, no server rendering means like we're gonna kind of leave these people out. Maybe we could bring on board and help them move huge chunks of their site to static. That makes sense as that. So you still get a better site. But yeah, it has some server in there, and I think that's still within the umbrella to me. That's
it's a great question because I agree. I think that I like this idea of static first because it's more of a spectrum. But on the other hand, I think if we're like every single use case, this thing needs an answer for, then it does become synonymous with web development because it's like this is it needs to cover every use case. So I feel like at some point some decisions need to get made.
I do agree with that. And that's I think so. Someone who's been involved in trying to propose, I think at the last count, umpteen different definitions of Jamstack over the years. I think the challenges always came when we tried to make it more inclusive to other parts of the paradigm, like adding serverless functions or what have you. And while I wholeheartedly agree with what Brian's saying about what he should feel comfortable building and what should be kind of a blessed approach, I completely agree with that. I think by giving the wiggle room and the variables, that makes it harder for people to have a clear mental model to start with. I think in the last panel, I think Cassidy used a phrase which I'm fairly sure we used to use internally at Netlify a lot about when we're trying to talk about this and saying rendering as much as possible ahead of time, or I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it was that was the spirit of it. And was it I fear servers? No, that was just something we all live and breathe, but or many of us. But it was the idea of as much as is possible, and it's that kind of variable. Well, I completely agree with the approach and that philosophy and that kind of value. As a definition, that becomes difficult because then there's the gray area. So I don't know. Static first resonates with me very much, and I've spoken to loads of people who use that term, and I think that's a great approach for me, and it aligns with so many of the things that we've said. But yeah, the expanding this idea out to include more things that are quote unquote dynamic in terms of happening at request time and cogs attending at request time, I think is where we start to get into difficulty. And no one's been more guilty of that than me. But that's one of the things I feel is a sticky point.
I'm in complete agreement with you, Phil, but I also feel like static first is about what we are. It's not about what we're not. And so like by saying not server rendered, it's like, okay, now we're kind of being exclusionary. Whereas static first doesn't tell you, it tells you, okay, you want to do the static. It doesn't tell you you can't do other things. It doesn't mean we have to write the other things into the definition. I think that there's a difference between the two things. It's not like we don't have to say like, okay, here's how server rendering fits in. We're just saying like, okay, we're static first. I mean, to me, it's a little more inclusive to talk about what the principles were, but we that we're about than about the things that we're not.
Yeah. So let me ask Henri this, and chat. Feel free to pipe up. I'm keen to hear it. Do we think this is a community? Is this the static site fan club, or is it a philosophy of trying to build as much static? Like static first. What's your thoughts, Henri?
I mean, am I going to be the tiebreaker here?
No tie. We're not locking anything today.
The whole time I was like, okay, does it make sense to say, not only static or something like that? I was trying to create an acronym in my mind. Again, I'm a million apologies because that's what we do in web performance. I do agree with the static first sort of like name or whatever phrase, simply because again, it does not necessarily mean that it can't be dynamic, and I think of again, potentially, by fault, but I think of how it was described to me very early. And a lot of it was about being static, and even static at the edge. And that always kind of sat with me because, in perf, we'd be like, oh, getting stuff at the edge is amazing, and that kind of just always kind of, is something that I kept in mind. Now, again, we could talk about, what Brian said and what has happened over the years. And as things really progress and got modern, as I like to say, a lot of the dynamic, implementations came about, and I'm totally cool with that. But, in my mind is like, okay, finger snaps, how could I get this out to the edge static so things are like, snappy? So I'll just kind of leave it at that, but I'm not saying that it can never be dynamic, far from. But I do like the idea of saying just static first. And then, if you have any questions later, yeah, we'll get to that.
Yeah.
I kind of wish, I wish the world was different. I wish things, I think it was easier for us to say, it's this really simple, very constrained thing, which, by the way, is the best foundation for all of these different places it could take you. And at the point that you cross the boundary between something being purely a bunch of assets, whatever those might be, in a folder, into something that has a little bit more complexity and a little bit more richness, or whatever you want to say, I wish we didn't have to then have this kind of emotional moment where we cross that boundary and say, now the threshold has been passed, and so I have to leave this Discord server and join only another one. So for me, I think it's a really good fundamental way of getting closer to the metal, I think, which, the phrase that Stephanie used earlier on, for longer than maybe we always used to think was possible, as complexity and sites grew, but not at the exclusion of all other things, So, I mean, I'm trying to pick and choose from the bits of the things that Brian said that I really, really like. And, I love this idea of progressively adding things that are, are good companions for it, and not getting upset that now the acronyms don't fit. Because another confession, also, I built a lot of Jamstack sites that didn't have any JavaScript at all, which again, I loved using part of an acronym. That's just my way.
Phil, I think it's evident that you should run for politics.
No. If you've seen the discussions on the Jamstack GitHub repo about the naming of Jamstack, you'll know that's not true. You'll know that I would be destined to failure.
Yeah, is it a capital AM, Phil?
No,
or
no, I'm not
lowercase
ready to talk about it. The
Yeah,
wound
let's
is
not go
still
there.
too raw.
Just playing.
So, yeah, I think we're all saying the same things. And we all don't want that hard line, and don't want it to be a big deal when you cross it. But like, coming back to this idea of static, so like, these are two interesting directions to achieve that. I think if it's the static site fan club, I'm gonna add that. Static site fan club. Then it's up to the community to really, police isn't the right word, to have those conversations and not like be aggressive about enforcing that line, and talking about trade-offs rather than, this isn't static, so it's not good. Like, it's really as a community, we need to just be really diligent about how we talk about it. And if we were, I feel like that could work. But then the static first approach kind of has that built in for the start, where you're naturally going to talk about, well, how would I make this more static? Or I'm going to make it less static because I need this dynamic thing, and I can't do that in a static world.
And it's interesting as well. Sorry to interrupt you, Mike. It's interesting as well to me that folks have been building sites in other ways, using kind of large, expensive, complex, monolithic, dynamic, reassuringly expensive products for a long time. Have actually been pursuing this idea of trying to get things static by adding caching layers on top.
Yeah.
They're trying to get to the point that you've got lots of static things served there, and it's the tooling to get there has been different. But of course, as a developer there, you're operating in a different model, that's you're doing things that are dynamic, that at some point there'll be a layer put on there that will imbue the assets with this attribute of being static and having all of those great characteristics on the back of it. But the camp that you live in as a developer is not there. You're living in a dynamic world, whereas I think when we're talking about it this way, it's like, well, we're doing that by default. We're creating things that are static by default. And actually the complexity is just moved into a different place. Now the cogs turn in the build rather than at request time. So, the mistakes can happen in your house rather than in your user's house. And I'm just a huge fan of that. So sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but when I see Static Site Fan Club, I'm in. I'd wear the jacket. The thing that I think is really important for us is the education around the word static, because static is a virtue, but it doesn't describe the experience. And that's the kind of misunderstanding, I think, that was at the heart of all of this way back when, where people were like, well, no, I'm not having a static site because I'm Acme brand 2.0 and we've got dynamic things. So
yeah,
I don't know what the point of all of those words again was, but
no, I think that's a good point. Like, we've got 2 minutes left, so I'm just going to, this is probably dangerous to start, but it's a question of who, because I like, who is this community for? Because we have like web developers, and then we also have, I guess, like marketers or people wanting a website. And like Jamstack was trying to cover both of these. And to your point, Phil, trying to get make it sound exciting for someone who's like, oh, static, that must just be something from the 90s and not good. The question is, like, do we need to cover both of these? Like, if someone's building a static website for a client today, you know, back 10 years ago, we would say, the client might say, I want a WordPress site. But now I feel like they would just say, I want a website, I want it to be fast, I need it to scale. Like, you don't even need to talk about the technology. We can't go into that. I would love to, but I'm gonna wrap this up with a few comments. Let me unshare this. So, what was the first stack we remember hearing about? For me, it was Lampstack in the early 2000s. I feel worried that developers enjoying server-side rendering are going to feel excluded. I don't feel worried that developers enjoying server-side rendering. Yeah, I'd be very proud to say I'm a member of the Static Site fan club. Me too. Thanks, Salma. A big thing for me was how empowering it felt for front-end developers. Like, I can build entire sites without having to write any server-side logic. Building with just the fundamentals was suddenly enough. Completely agree.
That's the thing I'm scared about being at risk at the moment, if I'm honest, as frameworks that have born out of a slightly different approach and now getting bigger and bigger and do more and more things. I'm worried that feeling and that that quote there is at risk. And that's the thing I'm anxious about at the moment, if I'm honest.
The last quote?
Yeah.
Could you pull it back up again? If that's not too much to ask.
Yeah. Let me...
Yeah, I mean, for me, the empowering bit is what drew me. And again, Phil does not remember, but I think he was in Toronto for Smashing, and I was just like watching it, and I'm like, oh my god! And a bunch of thoughts, and the empowerment really kind of stuck with me, and I was in Phil's ear for probably 15, 20 minutes straight. You know, kind of like I was having a wow moment in front of him. He didn't know again, but and I literally began the process to start the Jamstack Toronto, like right after, and I saw that moment right there take place. Now between then and now, a lot took place, but I get back to the idea that I feel like the community, I felt the people that I saw showing up at these Jamstack meetups were people who were fairly well versed, in the fundamentals and a bunch of things, and were very much interested in something new, something sort of what may have seemed at that moment potentially futuristic. You know what I mean? And so yeah, I completely agree with that last statement comment. On Twitch.
Yeah, 100%. I feel like we really took a big step forward here of just trying to wrap our head around what it is, which is probably one of the most important things for a community is like agreement on that. Thank you, all the panelists, and Stephanie, who just left early. This has been a fantastic conversation. Everyone in chat. Yeah, looking forward to doing this again.
Yeah,
Awesome.
Thanks so much, Mike. It's great.
Yeah, thanks.
Totally appreciate it. Thanks for having me and us. Whatever.
Thanks, Tim.
Cool.
Cheers.
Thanks a lot.